If you had seen Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell 3 years ago, standing at attention during the ceremony where she received her commendation for excellence in satellite communication systems, you never would have guessed that within 18 months she would be walking home alone in her dress whites, ignored by the very institution she had served with distinction for 12 years. The photographs from that ceremony show a woman with her shoulders squared, her gaze steady, her uniform pressed to perfection. But those who knew what was happening behind the scenes, who understood the politics brewing in the Office of Naval Intelligence, saw something very different in the tension around her eyes. The warning signs were there, subtle but present, like hairline fractures in steel that would eventually split wide open under pressure. The rain started as a light mist that afternoon in late October, the kind that doesn't seem threatening at first but slowly soaks through everything. Sarah walked along the chain-link fence that bordered the Norfolk Naval Station, her white uniform growing damp, her cap pulled low over her eyes. The weight of her service bag cut into her shoulder, filled with the personal items she had been allowed to collect from her desk after the security escort had watched her empty her drawers. A coffee mug with the Naval Intelligence insignia. A framed photograph of her commissioning day. 3 commendation certificates rolled into a cardboard tube. 17 pens she had accumulated over the years. Each one a souvenir from a different briefing. A different crisis, a different moment when her expertise had been essential. Her feet ached in the dress shoes she rarely wore anymore, the kind required for formal proceedings like the administrative hearing that had just ended. The hearing where they had stripped her of her security clearance, removed her from active duty status, and recommended her for immediate separation from the Navy. All because she had refused to sign off on a satellite communication protocol that she knew contained a critical vulnerability. All because she had put the truth ahead of the career advancement of a superior officer who wanted the flawed system approved before the end of the fiscal year so it would reflect well in his promotion packet. The fence stretched endlessly beside her, topped with coiled razor wire that gleamed dully in the gray afternoon light. Beyond it, she could see the parking lots where she used to park every morning at 0500 hours, arriving before almost anyone else because that was when she did her best work, when the operations center was quiet and she could focus on the complex algorithms and signal patterns that most people found incomprehensible. She had loved those early morning hours, loved the hum of the servers, loved the way the multiple screens glowed in the dimness, loved the satisfaction of solving problems that other analysts had given up on. But that was over now. The badge that had granted her access to those spaces had been deactivated at 1400 hours. The passwords to the systems she had helped design had been changed. The security protocols she had written had been assigned to someone else, someone who would follow orders without questioning the dangerous shortcuts being mandated from above. Sarah's uniform clung to her shoulders as the mist turned to steady drizzle. She could have called a rideshare, could have asked one of the few colleagues who still spoke to her for a ride, but she needed to walk. Needed to feel the distance growing between herself and the place that had been her entire adult life. Needed the physical exhaustion to match the emotional numbness that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. A bus hissed past, spraying water from a puddle that soaked her ankles. The driver didn't even glance her way. 3 cars passed, all with Department of Defense stickers on their windshields, all driven by people who worked on the base. Not one slowed down. Not one offered help to a woman in uniform walking in the rain. It wasn't that they didn't see her. It was that they had already heard. Word traveled fast in the military community. Especially word about someone who had been labeled a troublemaker, someone who had refused to be a team player, someone who had put their own judgment ahead of the chain of command. She passed the bus stop where she used to wait on the rare occasions her car was in the shop. The bench was occupied by 2 young sailors in their working uniforms, both staring at their phones. Neither looked up as she walked by. Once upon a time, they would have stood, would have acknowledged her rank, would have offered the seat to a superior officer. But her uniform might as well have been invisible now. She was a ghost, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when you didn't play the game. The irony was almost funny. Almost. She had spent 12 years becoming one of the Navy's top experts in satellite communication security. She had briefed admirals and Pentagon officials. She had identified vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by hostile nations. She had developed encryption protocols that were still classified at the highest levels. She had been so good at her job that she had been handpicked for the Office of Naval Intelligence, had been fast-tracked for promotion, had been told repeatedly that she had a bright future ahead of her. And then Commander Richard Hastings had arrived, transferred in from a cushy posting in Hawaii where he had spent 3 years playing golf and attending diplomatic functions. Hastings was connected, his father a retired rear admiral, his uncle a defense contractor with deep pockets and deeper influence. Hastings wanted to make his mark quickly, wanted a signature achievement he could point to in his promotion board package. So he had pushed for the rapid deployment of a new satellite communication system that would network all naval vessels in the Pacific Theater, allowing for real-time coordination of operations. It was an ambitious project, and Sarah had been assigned to lead the security assessment. She had spent 6 months analyzing the system, running penetration tests, identifying weaknesses. And she had found a critical flaw in the encryption handshake protocol, a vulnerability that could allow a sophisticated adversary to intercept and decrypt naval communications. She had documented it thoroughly, had presented her findings to Hastings, had recommended a delay in deployment until the flaw could be fixed. Hastings had been furious. The deployment timeline was tied to the fiscal year budget cycle. If they missed the deadline, the funding would be reallocated, the project would be delayed by at least 18 months, and his chance to claim credit for a major achievement would evaporate. He had ordered her to revise her assessment, to downgrade the severity of the vulnerability, to recommend deployment with a plan to patch the flaw later. Sarah had refused. She had explained, calmly and professionally, that the vulnerability was too significant to ignore, that deploying the system in its current state would put naval operations at risk, that lives could be lost if hostile actors exploited the weakness. Hastings had told her she was being overly cautious, that perfect was the enemy of good, that the Navy couldn't afford to let bureaucratic overcaution prevent progress. She had stood her ground, and so Hastings had gone over her head, had found analysts who were willing to sign off on the deployment, had buried her objections in paperwork and bureaucracy. And when she had tried to escalate her concerns through official channels, when she had filed a formal dissent with the Inspector General's office, Hastings had struck back. He had accused her of insubordination, of failure to follow lawful orders, of conduct unbecoming an officer. He had used his connections to ensure that her security clearance review was expedited, that her personnel file was flagged, that the administrative hearing was stacked with officers who owed him favors. The hearing had been a formality. The outcome had been predetermined. She had presented her evidence, had defended her actions, had explained that she had been trying to protect the Navy and the sailors who would depend on the flawed system. But the panel had sided with Hastings. They had questioned her judgment, her attitude, her fitness to serve. They had made it clear that officers who couldn't follow orders, who couldn't be team players, who put their own opinions ahead of the chain of command, had no place in the modern Navy. And so here she was, walking home in the rain, her career over at 34 years old, her reputation destroyed, her future uncertain. The apartment she rented was 3 miles from the base, a distance she had driven thousands of times but had never walked. Her car was still in the base parking lot, but her access had been revoked, and she would have to arrange to have someone retrieve it for her. Another humiliation, another reminder of how completely she had been cut off from the life she had known. The rain intensified, drumming against her cap, running down her face. Her dress whites were soaked through now, the fabric heavy and cold against her skin. Her feet were blistering in the stiff shoes. But she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because that was all she could do. Keep moving forward even when there was nothing to move toward. She thought about her father, a retired Marine colonel who had been so proud when she had received her commission. He had died 2 years ago, and she was grateful he hadn't lived to see this. He had been old school, a believer in honor and duty and doing the right thing no matter the cost. He would have understood why she had refused to sign off on the flawed system. He would have been proud of her for standing her ground. But he also would have been heartbroken to see her career end in disgrace, to see her walking home alone in the rain, rejected by the institution they had both served. Her mother had called that morning before the hearing. She lived in Arizona now, in a retirement community, and she had been following the situation as best she could. She had offered to fly out, to be there for support, but Sarah had told her not to come. What was the point? There was nothing her mother could do, nothing anyone could do. The decision had already been made. The fix had been in from the start. The neighborhood where she lived appeared ahead, a collection of modest apartment complexes and small houses that catered to military families and junior personnel. She could see her building in the distance, a 3-story structure with peeling paint and a parking lot full of economy cars. It wasn't much, but it had been home for the past 4 years, a place to sleep and eat between the long hours she spent at work. Now it would be the place where she tried to figure out what came next, how to rebuild a life that had been completely dismantled. A truck passed, music blaring from its open windows, the driver singing along without a care in the world. Sarah watched it disappear around a corner, envying that carefree obliviousness. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt that way, unburdened by responsibility, free from the weight of consequences. Even before this disaster, she had carried the stress of her work, the knowledge that mistakes in her field could cost lives, that the security of communication systems was literally a matter of national security. Maybe that had been her mistake. Maybe she had cared too much, had taken it all too seriously. Maybe if she had been willing to compromise, to go along to get along, to trust that someone else would fix the problems later, she would still have her career. She would still have her clearance. She would still have a purpose. But even now, even after everything that had happened, she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. The vulnerability was real. The risk was real. And if she had signed off on the deployment, if she had put her career ahead of her conscience, she wouldn't have been able to live with herself. Some things mattered more than advancement, more than approval, more than fitting in. She was half a block from her apartment when she felt it. A vibration in the ground, subtle at first, like the rumble of distant thunder. But the sky, though gray and overcast, showed no signs of a storm beyond the steady rain. The vibration grew stronger, accompanied by a deep thrumming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah stopped walking, her hand instinctively going to steady the service bag on her shoulder. The sound grew louder, a rhythmic hoomp that she recognized immediately. Helicopters, multiple helicopters, close and getting closer. She looked up, scanning the gray sky, and her breath caught in her throat. They came from the east, flying low over the rooftops, a formation of 3 Black Hawk helicopters in tight formation. The noise was overwhelming now, the rotors creating a windstorm that bent trees and sent trash skittering across the street. Sarah stood frozen on the sidewalk, rain streaming down her face, as the helicopters descended toward the parking lot of her apartment complex. People emerged from buildings, drawn by the impossible sound of military aircraft landing in their neighborhood. Car doors opened, windows filled with faces. A crowd began to gather at the edge of the parking lot as the lead helicopter touched down, its skids settling onto the wet asphalt with a hydraulic hiss. The other 2 helicopters took up positions overhead, circling in a protective pattern that Sarah recognized from tactical operations. The side door of the lead helicopter slid open before the rotors had fully spooled down. A figure jumped out, followed by 3 others. They wore naval uniforms, but these weren't the working uniforms of everyday personnel. These were dress blues, the kind worn by senior officers for important occasions. And they were moving with purpose, with urgency, scanning the growing crowd with intense focus. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Helicopters didn't land in civilian neighborhoods. Senior officers didn't deploy in formation to apartment complexes. This was the kind of response reserved for national emergencies, for terrorist attacks, for scenarios she had trained for but never actually experienced. The lead officer was a captain, 3 thick stripes gleaming on his sleeve despite the rain. He was tall, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in command. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the faces, and then he spoke in a voice that cut through the noise of the helicopters. "We're looking for Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell." The crowd parted instinctively, people turning to look at each other, searching for the person named. Sarah stood paralyzed on the sidewalk, still half a block away, her mind racing through possibilities and finding none that made sense. This had to be about Hastings. This had to be some new humiliation he had arranged, some final insult to drive home her disgrace. But the captain's face showed no malice, no satisfaction. He looked worried, urgent. And when his eyes found her, standing alone in her soaked dress whites, his expression shifted to something like relief. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," he said, moving toward her with long strides, his officers following. "Captain James Morrison, Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. We need you to come with us immediately." Sarah found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. "I'm no longer on active duty, Captain. As of 1400 hours today, I was separated from service. You'll need to find someone else for whatever this is." Morrison stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the water beating on his uniform, the tension in his jaw. "Ma'am, your separation orders have been suspended pending resolution of an urgent national security matter. We need your expertise, and we need it now." "My security clearance was revoked," Sarah said, and she hated how defeated she sounded. "I can't help you even if I wanted to. Your clearance has been reinstated at the highest level," Morrison said, "by direct order of the Secretary of the Navy." "Lieutenant Commander, I'm not asking. The Secretary sent us specifically for you. We have a situation that only you can resolve, and we're running out of time." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. The Secretary of the Navy. The highest level of clearance. A situation that only she could resolve. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. What situation? She asked. Morrison glanced at the crowd, at the dozens of people watching this scene unfold, at the phones recording everything. I can't brief you here. We need to get you airborne and to the Pentagon immediately. I'll explain everything en route. The Pentagon, Sarah repeated. She had been to the Pentagon twice in her career, both times for high-level briefings that had required weeks of preparation. You didn't just fly to the Pentagon on a moment's notice. You didn't land helicopters in parking lots and demand that disgraced former officers drop everything and come with you. Unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. The realization hit her like ice water. The satellite communication system. The vulnerability she had documented. The flaw that Hastings had dismissed as insignificant. Something had happened. Something bad enough that they needed her despite everything, needed her expertise badly enough to override her separation, to restore her clearance, to send helicopters to extract her from a residential neighborhood. The Pacific Fleet System, she said, and it wasn't a question. Morrison's expression confirmed it. We need to move, Commander. Now. Sarah looked down at her soaked uniform, at the service bag still cutting into her shoulder, at the apartment building where she had been planning to spend the evening trying to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. Then she looked back at Morrison, at the helicopters waiting with their rotors still turning, at the crowd watching with phones raised and expressions of shock. Let me grab my laptop from my apartment, she said. If this is what I think it is, I'll need my analysis files. We have everything from your office, Morrison said. Everything that was on your workstation has been copied to a secure system on the aircraft. We need to leave immediately. He gestured toward the helicopter, and Sarah found herself walking toward it, her wet shoes squelching with each step. The crowd parted to let them through, and she could hear the murmurs, the speculation, the confusion. Someone called out asking if everything was okay if there was an emergency. Morrison ignored them, his focus entirely on getting Sarah to the helicopter. One of the junior officers took her service bag, handling it with care despite the urgency. Another offered a hand to help her climb into the helicopter, though she didn't need it. She had done helicopter training during her officer qualification courses, had spent time on naval vessels where helicopter operations were routine. But she accepted the gesture anyway, letting him steady her as she stepped up into the cabin. The interior was configured for command operations, not transport. Banks of equipment lined both sides, screens glowing with data feeds and communication channels. 2 analysts were already at work, their fingers flying over keyboards, their faces illuminated by the blue-white light of their displays. They looked up as Sarah entered, and she saw the recognition in their eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like hope. Morrison climbed in behind her, followed by his officers. The pilot didn't wait for further orders. The turbine spooled up with a rising whine, and Sarah felt the helicopter lift off the ground, the parking lot dropping away beneath them. Through the open door, she could see the crowd growing smaller, see the other 2 helicopters falling into formation, see the city of Norfolk spreading out below as they climbed into the gray sky. Morrison handed her a headset, and she put it on, the noise of the rotors immediately dampening to a manageable level. His voice came through clear and urgent. Commander, 3 hours ago, the Pacific Fleet lost all satellite communications with its vessels operating in the South China Sea. Every ship, every aircraft, every submarine in the theater went dark simultaneously. We're talking about 47 vessels, including 2 carrier strike groups, completely cut off from command and control. Sarah's stomach dropped. This was worse than she had imagined. Worse than the worst-case scenario she had documented in her security assessment. The encryption handshake vulnerability, she said. Someone exploited it. We believe so, Morrison confirmed. But it's more than just interception. Whoever did this has managed to completely lock us out of the communication network. We can't reach our ships. We can't coordinate operations. And we have no way of knowing if the vessels are under attack or if they're even still operational. We're flying blind, Commander, and the President is considering options that range from attempting a manual reset of every vessel's communication system to assuming we're under attack and escalating to a war footing. A manual reset would take days, Sarah said, her mind already racing through the system architecture. And if you assume attack and escalate, you could start a war based on a technical failure. Exactly, Morrison said. Which is why we need you. You documented this vulnerability. You understand the system architecture better than anyone. And according to your reports, you identified a potential backdoor that could be used to regain control of the network in exactly this kind of scenario. Sarah nodded slowly. She had identified that backdoor, had documented it as part of her security assessment. It was a failsafe she had built into her analysis, a way to potentially recover from a catastrophic compromise of the encryption system. But she had also warned that using it would require precise timing and coordination, that a mistake could make the situation worse, that it should only be attempted by someone who understood the full complexity of the system. "I need to see the current system status," she said. "I need to know exactly what's happening with the network traffic. What kind of attack vector was used? Whether we're dealing with a state actor or something else." One of the analysts swiveled his screen toward her. "We've been monitoring everything since the blackout began. Here's the data feed." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes scanning the streams of information flowing across the screen. Network packets, encryption handshakes, signal routing protocols. She could see the pattern immediately, could see exactly where the attack had penetrated the system, could see how elegantly and devastatingly effective it was. "This is sophisticated," she said. "This is nation-state level capability, probably Chinese given the theater of operations. They found the exact vulnerability I documented, and they've weaponized it in a way that's actually more advanced than what I predicted. Can you fix it?" Morrison asked. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was working through the problem in her mind, tracing the attack backwards, identifying the points where the system could be vulnerable to a counter-intrusion. The backdoor she had documented was still there, still theoretically functional. But using it would require her to essentially hack her own security protocols to exploit the same kind of weakness she had spent her career trying to prevent. "Maybe," she said finally. "But I'll need direct access to the Network Operations Center at the Pentagon. I'll need full administrative privileges on the satellite communication system, and I'll need everyone to stay out of my way and let me work." "You'll have everything you need," Morrison promised. "The Secretary has authorized full operational control. Whatever you need, whoever you need, it's yours." The helicopter banked hard, turning south toward Washington. Through the window, Sarah could see the Virginia coastline falling away, could see the gray waters of the Atlantic stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the curve of the Earth, 47 naval vessels were operating blind, their commanders making decisions without guidance, their crews wondering if they were about to go to war. And she was the only person who might be able to help them. The irony was almost overwhelming. 6 hours ago, she had been declared unfit to serve, stripped of her clearance, separated from the Navy. The same people who had dismissed her concerns, who had called her overly cautious and insubordinate, were now depending on her to fix the disaster that her caution had predicted. The same system that had rejected her was now begging her to save it. But this wasn't about vindication. This wasn't about proving she had been right. This was about 47 ships and thousands of sailors who were in danger because people in positions of authority had made bad decisions. This was about preventing a potential war that could start because of a technical vulnerability that should have been fixed months ago. "What about Commander Hastings?" she asked. "He's the one who pushed for deployment despite my warnings. He's the one who signed off on the flawed system. Is he involved in the response?" Morrison's expression hardened. "Commander Hastings is currently in a conference room at the Pentagon being questioned by the Inspector General's office and representatives from Naval Criminal Investigative Service. His role in this situation is being thoroughly examined." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction at that, though it was tempered by the urgency of the crisis. Hastings would face consequences, but that would come later. Right now, she had work to do. The flight to Washington took 45 minutes, the 3 helicopters racing south at maximum speed. Sarah spent the time reviewing the data feeds, familiarizing herself with the current state of the compromised system, mentally mapping out the steps she would need to take to exploit the backdoor and regain control of the network. It was like solving a puzzle she had designed herself, except the stakes were infinitely higher than any training exercise or theoretical scenario. The Pentagon appeared ahead, its distinctive 5-sided shape unmistakable even from the air. The helicopters descended toward the helipad reserved for high-priority arrivals, and Sarah could see a cluster of officers waiting on the ground, their uniforms marking them as senior leadership. This wasn't a routine response. This was the kind of mobilization that happened during national emergencies. The helicopter touched down with barely a bump, and Morrison was out the door before the skids had fully settled. Sarah followed, her soaked uniform now starting to dry in the cabin's heat, but still uncomfortable and heavy. The waiting officers moved forward as one, and she recognized several of them from briefings and official photographs. An admiral. 2 generals. A woman in civilian clothes who Sarah guessed was from the intelligence community. "Commander Mitchell," the admiral said, extending his hand. "Admiral Richard Chen, Vice Chief of Naval Operations. Thank you for coming." Sarah shook his hand, noting the irony of being thanked for something she hadn't exactly volunteered for. "Sir, I understand we have a situation with the Pacific Fleet Communications. That's putting it mildly, Admiral Chen said. Follow me. We've set up an operations center with everything you should need. They moved quickly through the Pentagon's corridors, their group drawing stares from the personnel they passed. Sarah was acutely aware of her appearance, her wrinkled and still damp uniform, her hair plastered to her head, the absence of any of the usual preparations she would have made before appearing at the Pentagon. But no one seemed to care about protocol right now. The only thing that mattered was fixing the crisis. The operations center was deep in the building, a secure space that required multiple authentication checks to access. Inside, it looked like every command center Sarah had ever worked in, multiplied by 10. Dozens of workstations, each manned by analysts and technicians. Giant screens on the walls displaying maps, data feeds, status reports. The air hummed with tension and the low murmur of urgent conversations. A workstation had been prepared for her, positioned at the center of the room where everyone could see what she was doing. 3 monitors, a high-speed connection to the satellite communication network, and a level of system access that made her breath catch. She had full administrative control, complete authority over every aspect of the network. The kind of power that was usually distributed across multiple people with layers of oversight and approval. They were trusting her completely. Or they were desperate enough that trust was irrelevant. Sarah sat down, her fingers already moving across the keyboard, pulling up the network architecture diagram she had memorized months ago. Around her, the operations center quieted slightly, dozens of people watching as she worked. She could feel their eyes on her, could sense their hope and their doubt in equal measure. She pulled up the attack analysis first, tracing the intrusion vector step by step. The hostile actors had entered through the encryption handshake vulnerability, exactly as she had predicted, but they had done something clever with the timing that amplified the impact. They had waited until the maximum number of vessels were online simultaneously, then triggered the attack in a cascading pattern that overwhelmed the system's defensive protocols. It was elegant and devastating. The work of people who understood the system almost as well as she did. "Talk to us, Commander," Admiral Chen said from behind her. "What are we looking at?" "The attack exploited the encryption handshake vulnerability I documented 8 months ago," Sarah said, her eyes never leaving the screens. "They've used it to inject malicious code into the authentication servers, which has effectively locked us out of our own network. Every time we try to establish a connection with a vessel, the malicious code intercepts the handshake and denies authentication." "Can we just shut down the network and restart it?" someone asked. "No," Sarah said. "If we shut down the network, we lose any chance of regaining control through software means. We'd have to physically access every vessel and manually reset their communication systems, which would take weeks and leave the fleet vulnerable during the entire process. And the hostile actors have probably anticipated that response. They may have built in triggers that would activate if we attempt a full shutdown, potentially causing permanent damage to the system. So what's the solution?" Admiral Chen asked. "The backdoor I documented," Sarah said. "It's a failsafe I built into the security architecture during the initial design phase. It allows for a master override of the authentication system, but only if you know the exact sequence of commands and execute them with precise timing. It's essentially a way to hack our own system, to bypass the compromised authentication servers and re-establish direct control. And you can do this." "I can try," Sarah said. "But I need everyone to understand the risks. If I make a mistake, if I execute the sequence incorrectly, I could permanently lock us out of the system. We'd be in a worse position than we are now. And even if I do everything right, there's no guarantee the hostile actors haven't anticipated this move and built in countermeasures." The room was silent for a moment. Then Admiral Chen spoke, his voice firm. "Commander, you're the expert. You documented this vulnerability, you designed the back door, and you're the one who tried to prevent this situation from happening in the first place. If anyone can fix this, it's you. You have full authority to proceed however you think best." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of that authority settle on her shoulders. She pulled up the backdoor access protocols, the complex sequence of commands that she had designed specifically to be nearly impossible to execute by accident or through brute force. It required knowledge of the system architecture, understanding of the encryption algorithms, and precise timing down to the millisecond. She had designed it. She had tested it in simulation. But she had never executed it in a live operational environment with 47 ships and thousands of lives depending on the outcome. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, and she thought about everything that had led to this point. The months of analysis. The warnings that had been ignored. The career that had been destroyed because she had refused to compromise. The walk home in the rain just hours ago, convinced that her service to the Navy was over. And now here she was, given complete control over the same system that had been the source of all that conflict. The people who had dismissed her were now depending on her. The institution that had rejected her was now begging her to save it. But this wasn't about them. This was about the sailors on those ships, the young men and women who had joined the Navy to serve their country and who were now in danger because of decisions made by people who had prioritized career advancement over security. This was about preventing a war that could start because of a technical failure. This was about doing the right thing, regardless of personal cost. Sarah began typing, her fingers moving with practiced precision, executing the first phase of the backdoor sequence. The commands scrolled across her screen, each one carefully crafted to exploit specific weaknesses in the authentication system, to bypass the malicious code, to establish a direct connection to the core network servers. The room watched in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sounds were the clicking of Sarah's keyboard and the soft hum of the equipment around them. The first phase completed successfully. A small indicator on her screen turned green, showing that she had successfully bypassed the first layer of compromised security. But that was the easy part. The next phase would be more difficult, requiring her to essentially inject her own code into the authentication servers, to overwrite the malicious code without triggering any defensive protocols that might be in place. She pulled up a secondary window, monitoring the network traffic in real time, watching for any signs that her intrusion had been detected. The hostile actors were sophisticated. They would have monitoring systems in place. They would be watching for exactly this kind of counter-intrusion. If they detected her too early, they could trigger countermeasures that would make the situation irreversible. Sarah worked methodically, each command carefully considered, each timing precisely calculated. She was operating at the edge of her expertise, pushing the limits of what she understood about the system, relying on intuition and experience to guide her through the complex sequence of operations. Minutes passed like hours. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Her hands remained steady, but inside she was a tangle of tension and focus. One mistake would end this. One miscalculation would lock them out permanently. The second phase completed. Another green indicator. She was halfway through the sequence now, but the most dangerous part was still ahead. The final phase would require her to simultaneously execute multiple commands across different system components, a coordinated strike that would either restore control or trigger catastrophic failure. "Commander," someone said softly, and Sarah realized it was Admiral Chen. "You're doing fine. Take your time. We trust you." Those words, coming from a senior officer she had never met before today, meant more than she would have expected. "We trust you." The same institution that had stripped her of her clearance, that had separated her from service, that had walked past her in the rain without stopping, was now trusting her with its most critical crisis. Sarah took a breath, steadied herself, and began the final phase. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a complex ballet of commands that had to be timed to the millisecond. She was working across multiple windows now, monitoring 6 different data streams simultaneously, watching for the precise moment when all the conditions would align for the master override to succeed. The hostile code fought back. She could see it on her screens, see the defensive protocols activating, see the countermeasures trying to block her intrusion. But she had designed this system. She knew its weaknesses better than anyone. She knew exactly where to strike, exactly how to exploit the gaps in the security architecture that she had intentionally built into the back door. One command, another, a third. The timing had to be perfect. If she executed too early, the hostile code would block her. If she executed too late, the window would close and she would have to start over, giving the hostile actors time to adapt and strengthen their defenses. Now, Sarah hit the final command sequence, a cascade of instructions that rippled through the network like a shockwave. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The screen showed only the processing indicators, the system working through the complex calculations required to execute the master override. Then, one by one, the authentication servers began to respond. Green indicators appeared on her screen, each one representing a successful restoration of control. The hostile code was being purged, overwritten by her master override commands. The malicious authentication protocols were being replaced with legitimate ones. The operations center erupted in controlled celebration. People were standing, pointing at the screens, calling out confirmations. Sarah heard Admiral Chen on a phone, reporting the success to someone at the highest levels of command. But she kept her eyes on her screens, monitoring the process, making sure the override was completing successfully across all system components. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. The green indicators multiplied, spreading across the network map like a healing wave. Vessel by vessel, the Pacific Fleet was coming back online. Communication channels were being reestablished. Commanders were reporting in, confirming their status, resuming normal operations. Sarah finally allowed herself to lean back in her chair, her hands shaking slightly now that the immediate crisis was over. She had done it. Against all odds, despite the sophistication of the attack, despite the risk of catastrophic failure, she had successfully exploited her own back door and restored control of the network. Admiral Chen appeared at her side, his hand on her shoulder. "Outstanding work, Commander. You just prevented a potential international incident and possibly a war. The Secretary of the Navy is on his way down here personally to thank you." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already moving to the next problem. "Sir, we need to patch this vulnerability immediately. The hostile actors now know that we know about it, and they'll be looking for other ways to exploit the system. We need to implement the security fixes I recommended 8 months ago, and we need to do a complete security audit of the entire network." "Already in progress," Admiral Chen said. "I've ordered a full security review, and your recommendations are being implemented across the board. We're also conducting a thorough investigation into how this deployment was approved despite your warnings. There will be accountability, Commander. I promise you that." The Secretary of the Navy arrived 30 minutes later, accompanied by what seemed like half the Pentagon's senior leadership. Sarah stood at attention as he entered, her uniform now mostly dry but still wrinkled and showing the signs of her eventful day. "Commander Mitchell," the Secretary said, and his voice carried the weight of genuine gratitude. "On behalf of the President and the entire Navy, thank you. What you did here today prevented a crisis that could have had catastrophic consequences. Your expertise, your dedication, and your courage under pressure exemplify the very best of naval service." "Thank you, sir," Sarah said. "But I need to be clear. This crisis happened because my security warnings were ignored. The vulnerability I documented 8 months ago was exploited exactly as I predicted it would be. If my recommendations had been implemented when I first made them, none of this would have happened." The Secretary's expression grew serious. "I'm aware of that, Commander. I've been briefed on the full situation, including the circumstances of your separation from service. That separation has been officially rescinded. Your security clearance has been permanently reinstated at the highest level, and effective immediately, you're being promoted to the rank of Commander and assigned as the Director of Communication Security for the Office of Naval Intelligence." Sarah blinked, processing what she had just heard. Promoted. Director. The very position that would give her the authority to implement the kind of security protocols she had been advocating for all along. "Sir, what about Commander Hastings?" she asked. The Secretary's jaw tightened. "Commander Hastings is being relieved of duty pending the outcome of an investigation by NCIS and the Inspector General's office. Based on the preliminary findings, he will likely face court-martial for negligence, insubordination, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His actions put the fleet at risk and compromise national security. He will be held accountable. Justice. Real, tangible justice. Not just for her, but for the principle that security couldn't be compromised for career advancement, that expertise couldn't be dismissed for political convenience, that doing the right thing had to matter more than playing the game. There's one more thing," the Secretary continued. "Tomorrow morning, we're holding a press conference to address this incident. The public needs to know that the Navy's communication systems were compromised, but they also need to know that we successfully defended against that compromise, and they need to know who was responsible for that success. I want you there, Commander. I want the country to know that the Navy recognizes and rewards excellence, and that we listen to our experts even when the message is uncomfortable." A press conference. Public recognition. The complete opposite of the anonymous disgrace she had been walking toward just hours ago. Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions, relief and satisfaction, and a lingering sense of surrealism that any of this was actually happening. "I'll be there, sir," she said. The Secretary shook her hand, his grip firm and genuine. "The Navy is lucky to have you, Commander. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." After the Secretary left, Admiral Chen approached her again. "Commander, we've arranged quarters for you here in the Pentagon for tonight. Tomorrow, after the press conference, we'll get you properly set up in your new role. But for now, I think you've earned some rest. It's been quite a day." "Quite a day." That was an understatement of historic proportions. Sarah had gone from separated from service to director of communication security in the span of 6 hours. From walking home alone in the rain to being personally thanked by the Secretary of the Navy. From disgrace to vindication. But as she followed an aide to the temporary quarters, as she finally peeled off her damp uniform and stood under a hot shower that washed away the physical remnants of the day, she found herself thinking not about the triumph but about the cost. The months of fighting to be heard. The colleagues who had turned away. The career that had been nearly destroyed. The walk in the rain that had felt like the end of everything. She thought about all the other people in the military and in government who had seen problems, who had tried to raise concerns, who had been dismissed or silenced or punished for refusing to go along. How many of them never got their vindication? How many of them walked away defeated, their expertise ignored, their warnings unheeded until it was too late? She had been lucky. Lucky that the crisis had happened quickly enough that her expertise was still immediately relevant. Lucky that the system had failed in a way that was undeniable and urgent. Lucky that the people in charge had been forced to recognize their mistake and make it right. But luck wasn't a system. Luck wasn't a culture. And if the Navy really wanted to prevent situations like this from happening again, they needed to do more than promote one person who happened to be vindicated by circumstances. They needed to create an environment where expertise was valued over politics, where uncomfortable truths were heard instead of suppressed, where doing the right thing didn't require gambling your career. That was the work ahead of her now. As Director of Communication Security, she would have the authority to implement the technical fixes that were needed. But more importantly, she would have a platform to advocate for the cultural changes that were necessary to prevent the next crisis, the one that might not be solved by a lucky backdoor and a desperate helicopter ride. The next morning, Sarah stood in a Pentagon briefing room wearing a fresh uniform that had been provided overnight, her new rank insignia gleaming on her shoulders. The press conference was packed with reporters, cameras, and officials. The Secretary of the Navy stood at the podium, explaining the situation in carefully worded terms that acknowledged the compromise without revealing classified details about the attack vector or the response. Then he introduced her, and Sarah stepped forward into the lights and the cameras, into the public recognition that felt both gratifying and uncomfortable. She had never sought attention. She had only wanted to do her job well, to protect the system she was responsible for, to serve with competence and integrity. But she understood why this mattered. The public needed to see that the Navy valued expertise, that it rewarded people who did the right thing even when it was difficult, that it held people accountable when they made bad decisions. This press conference wasn't just about her. It was about the message it sent to everyone in uniform, everyone in government, everyone who might one day face the choice between career and conscience. She spoke briefly, thanking the team that had worked with her during the crisis, acknowledging the skill of the hostile actors who had perpetrated the attack, and emphasizing the importance of taking security warnings seriously even when they were inconvenient. She didn't mention Hastings by name, but everyone in the room understood who she was talking about. After the press conference, after the interviews and the photographs and the formal congratulations, Sarah finally had a moment to herself. She stood at a window in the Pentagon, looking out over the Virginia landscape, and pulled out her phone. She had dozens of messages, from former colleagues, from friends, from family. Her mother had sent a text that simply said, "I always knew you would make us proud." But the message that caught her attention was from someone she didn't immediately recognize. Then she realized it was from one of the young sailors she had passed at the bus stop the day before, one of the two who had been staring at their phones, who hadn't acknowledged her as she walked by in the rain. "Mom," the message read, "I saw the press conference. I was at that bus stop yesterday when you walked past. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I had heard the rumors about what happened to you, and I was scared to be seen talking to someone who was in trouble. But watching you today, seeing what you did, I understand now that you were right and everyone else was wrong. Thank you for not giving up, even when it cost you everything. You've taught me something important about what it means to be a naval officer. I hope I can be half as brave as you were when my turn comes." Sarah read the message twice, feeling emotions she couldn't quite name. This was why it mattered. Not the promotion, not the recognition, not even the vindication. It mattered because somewhere out there, young officers and enlisted personnel were watching, learning, deciding what kind of service members they wanted to be. And they needed to see that doing the right thing, even at great personal cost, was not only possible but valued. She typed a response. "Thank you for your message. The only advice I can give you is to trust your expertise, stand by your principles, and never compromise on matters of safety and security."
The Navy needs officers who will speak truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. Fair winds and following seas. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her office at the Office of Naval Intelligence, reviewing the implementation progress of the new security protocol she had designed. The vulnerability that had caused the Pacific Fleet crisis had been patched across all systems. New procedures were in place for security assessments, with multiple layers of independent review to ensure that concerns couldn't be dismissed by a single officer with a political agenda. Commander Hastings had been court-martialed and found guilty on multiple charges. He had been dismissed from service with loss of all benefits, a punishment that Sarah found both satisfying and sad. He had been a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when ambition trumped integrity, when career advancement mattered more than mission success. But more importantly, the Navy had implemented the Sarah Mitchell Protocol, named in her honor, a formal process for handling security concerns that ensured analysts and experts had direct channels to senior leadership, that their warnings had to be documented and addressed, that dismissing security concerns required formal justification and approval at the highest levels. It wasn't perfect. No system was perfect, but it was better. It gave the next person in her position a chance to be heard, a structure to ensure their expertise was valued, a process that made it harder for political considerations to override technical judgments. Sarah's phone rang and she saw it was Admiral Chen. "Commander, we have a situation developing in the Mediterranean. I need your assessment on some unusual network traffic patterns we're seeing. Can you come to the operations center?" "On my way, sir," Sarah said, already standing and reaching for her secure tablet. As she walked through the Pentagon corridors, her uniform crisp, her rank insignia reflecting the overhead lights, her security badge granting her access to the most sensitive spaces, she thought about that walk in the rain 6 months ago. The humiliation, the defeat, the sense that everything she had worked for had been destroyed. She had been wrong about that. Nothing had been destroyed. It had only been tested, refined, strengthened. The person she was now, the officer she had become, had been forged in that crucible of rejection and vindication. She understood her value in a way she never had before. She understood that true authority came not from rank or position, but from expertise and integrity, and the courage to stand by your principles, even when the cost was high. The operations center doors opened, and she stepped inside, ready to face whatever crisis awaited. Because that was what she did. That was who she was. Not because of the uniform or the rank or the recognition, but because she had learned the most important lesson anyone in her position could learn. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes the people in charge make terrible decisions. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything you've worked for. But you do it anyway. You stand your ground anyway. You speak the truth anyway. Because in the end, that's what service really means. Not following orders blindly, not protecting your career at all costs, not going along to get along. Real service means being willing to sacrifice everything, even your career, even your reputation, even your sense of belonging, to protect the people who depend on your expertise. And if you're very lucky, if circumstances align just right, if the universe decides to be fair for once, you might get vindicated. You might get your career back. You might even get recognized for doing what you should have been praised for all along. But even if none of that happens, even if you walk away in the rain with nothing but your integrity intact, you can live with yourself. You can look in the mirror and know you did the right thing. And sometimes, that has to be enough. For Sarah Mitchell,
it had been enough. The vindication, the promotion, the recognition, all of that was gratifying. But what mattered most was that she had stood her ground when it mattered, had refused to compromise on principles that were too important to sacrifice. And now, in her new role, with her new authority, she would work to build a system where the next person in her position wouldn't have to make the same impossible choice. She would work to build a Navy where expertise was valued, where speaking truth to power was encouraged, where doing the right thing didn't require heroic sacrifice. Because that was the real legacy she wanted to leave. Not her own vindication, but a culture that made vindication unnecessary. A system that listened the first time, that valued its experts, that put mission success ahead of political convenience. It was ambitious, maybe impossible, but she had learned something important over the past 6 months. Impossible just meant it would take a little longer, and she had time. She had authority. She had the credibility that came from being proven right when everyone else was wrong. And she had the memory of walking home in the rain, ignored and dismissed, a reminder of why this work mattered and who she was fighting for. Not for herself, not for recognition or advancement or revenge, but for every analyst, every technician, every expert who would one day face the same choice she had faced. Every person who would have to decide between career and conscience, between going along and speaking up, between protecting themselves and protecting the mission. She was fighting for them, and she would keep fighting for them, for as long as it took, until the system was better. Until doing the right thing didn't require the kind of courage that most people couldn't muster. Until expertise was valued automatically, not just in crisis, not just when the cost of ignoring it became undeniable. That was her mission now. That was her purpose. And as she settled into her workstation in the operations center, as her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, as she began analyzing the unusual network traffic that had prompted Admiral Chen's call, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Not because anyone had told her so, not because of rank or recognition or vindication, but because she knew, deep in her bones, that this was her calling. This was her service. This was what she had been preparing for all along, through the success and the failure, through the triumph and the humiliation, through the walk in the rain and the flight in the helicopter. All of it had led her here. All of it had been necessary. And she wouldn't change any of it, not even the painful parts, because they had made her into the officer she needed to be. The officer the Navy needed. The officer who would stand her ground, speak her truth, and fight for what was right, no matter the cost. That was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell. That was who she had always been, even when the system tried to tell her otherwise. And that was who she would always be, for as long as she wore the uniform, for as long as she had the privilege of serving, for as long as there were missions to accomplish and people to protect and truths to speak. The work was never done. The fight was never over, but she was ready. She had always been ready. And now, finally, the Navy was ready to listen.